Please, Merage, you have to help me. Bury my daughter.
The dust never really settles in a place like this. It just finds a new place to rest. It coats the sagging porch of the widow's cabin, films the windows until the world outside looks like a fever dream, and powders the grave at the edge of the property where a small wooden cross tilts towards the setting sun. Inside, the air was thick with silence and the smell of medicine that hadn't worked. The widow's world had shrunk to the four walls of the sick room, to the rhythm of a labored breath, to the small, burning hand in hers. And then it had shrunk further to the terrible, perfect stillness that followed. Now she sat in the hollow quiet, her own life feeling like a ghost limb, aching for a weight that was gone. Her girl, her bright-eyed bird of a daughter, was still under the thin quilt, but she was gone. The practical horror of what came next was a mountain the widow couldn't climb. She had no strength to dig, no preacher to call, no money to pay one if there was. There was only the vast, indifferent Arizona territory, and the stories people told in hushed tones about the Lone Apache who sometimes appeared like a shadow on the horizon. They said he was a ghost himself, a man split between two worlds and belonging to neither. They said he'd been a scout for the army once, had spoken their language and worn their clothes, until something had broken in him, or perhaps in them, and he'd walked away from both sides of the war. Now he drifted, a solitary figure seen tracing the spines of mesas or kneeling by lonely springs. Some feared him, some pitied him, all misunderstood him. But in her utter desolation, the widow remembered a different story, whispered by an old trapper at the general store years before. He'd said this Apache knew the old ways, the deep ways, the paths between the living and the dead. It wasn't a prayer that formed in her heart, but a desperate, wild plan. She would find him. She would beg. For 2 days she waited by the wash at the edge of the broken field, the one place where the water sometimes ran after a rain. She brought no offering but her grief, which was ample. On the third evening, as the sky bled orange and purple, he was just there. He hadn't crested the ridge or stepped from the brush. He was simply a part of the landscape that suddenly moved. He was tall, his face a map of hard lines and quiet endurance, his dark eyes holding a knowledge that made her want to look away. He wore a mix of hides and worn cavalry trousers, his long hair tied back. He said nothing, just watched her, waiting for the world to explain her presence in his path. The words tore from her throat, raw and dry as the land. "Bury my daughter," she begged, the sentence sounding less like a request and more like a shattered commandment. "Please, I got no one. I can't do it myself. She's inside. She needs to be in the earth. Proper," she gestured back toward the lonely cabin, her hand trembling. "I have a little silver. A locket, it's yours. Just give her that piece?" The Lone Apache looked past her, his gaze settling on the cabin as if he could see the small form through the walls. He was silent for a long time, long enough for the widow's hope to curdle into shame. She had asked a wild man for a Christian mercy. It was madness. Finally, his eyes returned to hers, and they were not unkind, but they were terrifying in their depth. He shook his head, a slow, deliberate motion. "No," he said, his voice a low rustle, like wind through canyon rock. A sob hitched in her chest. Of course, why would he help? She was nothing to him, just another white woman clinging to a scrap of land in a stolen country. She turned away, the finality of it crushing what little will she had left, but he spoke again. "I will not bury your daughter." He took a step closer, and the widow flinched, but he wasn't looking at her anymore. He was looking at the darkening sky, at the first bold stars pricking through the twilight. "You asked me to put her in the dark under the weight of the world. That is your way. It is a good way for those who are finished." He lowered his gaze back to her, and it was piercing. "Is she finished?" The question was so absurd, so cruel, the widow could only stare. "She's gone. Her fever broke her." "She's cold. The body is cold," he agreed. The spark that danced in her eyes, that made her laugh at the call of a coyote, that made her fingers curl around yours, where did that spark go? Did you see it leave? He didn't wait for an answer, which was good because she had none. My people have a word for the journey a spirit takes when the body falls. It is a long road. Sometimes for the young, for those taken too quick by sickness or violence, the spirit is startled, It does not know the path. It gets lost. It lingers here in the places it knew, crying in the wind you hear at night, brushing your cheek in the sunlight. It is a lonely thing, a hungry thing. A chill that had nothing to do with the evening air crept up the widow's spine. She thought of the whispers she'd imagined in the cabin, the sense of a presence just beyond her shoulder. Grief, she had told herself. Just grief. "I will not bury your daughter," he repeated, his tone now one of solemn offering. "But I will offer her marriage." The word hung in the air between them, foreign and heavy. It was not a word she knew. It sounded like Merage, but he said it with a hard G, a grounding, earthy sound. It was not a phantom, it was a thing. "What? What is that?" she whispered. "It is a leaving," he said, "a guided leaving. It is not for the body, it is for the spirit that remains. It is to show it the way to the star road, to help it find its ancestors, to let it finish its journey so it is not stuck." He glanced again at the cabin, his expression unreadable. "A lost spirit can make a place sad for a long time. It can pull at the living. It can call others to it." The widow's mind reeled. This was superstition, pagan belief. She was a woman who'd read the Bible, who believed in heaven and angels and a Savior's embrace. But her faith felt thin and distant now, a pretty picture on a wall in a room that was collapsing. What if he was right? What if her girl wasn't at peace? What if she was here, frightened and alone, unable to find her way? The thought was a new kind of agony, sharper than the grave. "You would do this?" she asked, her voice barely a breath. "This marriage?" He gave a single nod. "It is what is needed. The burying can come after. First, the spirit must be shown the door." The choice was an impossible canyon yawning at her feet. To trust in the familiar ritual, the solid feel of earth on wood, the verses she could half remember, or to trust this stranger, this man of the desert and its old secret gods with the most precious thing left in her world. Her eyes darted from his weathered face to the dark square of the cabin door. Inside, her daughter lay still. Outside, the night was growing deep, and the stars were emerging, a countless, glittering road across the black velvet sky. Was that the road he meant? "What must I do?" The words left her lips before she even knew she'd decided. "You must be ready to see," he said. "And you must be ready to let go, truly let go. The marriage is a path for her, but you cannot walk it with her. Your hand must open." He began to walk toward the cabin, not waiting for her consent. It was as if the decision had been made the moment he spoke the word. "Bring a blanket from her bed. We will go to the high place where the earth touches the sky." Trembling, the widow followed him inside. The room felt different with him in it, charged as if before a storm. He did not look at the small form on the bed, not directly. He murmured something under his breath, a soft series of clicks and tones that sounded like water over stone. He took a small pouch from his belt and sprinkled a fine, dark powder in the four corners of the room. A smell, sharp and green like crushed sage and something else, something ancient, filled the close air. "The blanket," he said gently. She took the thin quilt, the one her daughter had been under, still holding the faint, heartbreaking scent of her hair and sickness. They went back out into the full dark. The Apache led the way, not up the worn trail to town, but up a steep, rocky path behind the cabin she had never dared to climb. They walked in silence for what felt like hours, the only sounds their footfalls and the distant cry of a night bird. The widow's heart hammered against her ribs, part terror, part a wild, desperate hope. What was she doing? What was he going to do? At last, they reached a flat mesa top. The world fell away on all sides, and the sky was a vast, star-choked dome. It was breathtaking and terrifyingly lonely. He directed her to spread the blanket on the hard ground. Then, from his pouch, he took a small, flat drum and a rattle made of gourd and pebbles. "Sit," he said, pointing to a place near the edge of the blanket. "Watch the sky, listen, do not speak her name aloud. Hold her in your heart, then picture her walking ahead of you, away from you, into the light of the morning star. Can you do this?" She nodded, her throat too tight for words. She sat, drawing her knees to her chest, and looked up at the impossible spread of stars. He began a low, steady beat on the drum, a rhythm that seemed to sync with the pulse of the night itself. The rattle whispered like dry leaves in a slow wind. Then he began to chant. It was not a song, but a story told in sound, a calling, a guiding. The widow tried to focus, to picture her daughter's face, her smile, the way she used to skip. She tried to picture her walking, as he said, away, toward the brightest star on the eastern horizon. But the images wouldn't hold. Instead, she felt a pressure in the air, a thickening. The stars seemed to swim. The drumbeat was inside her now, in her bones. And then, on the very edge of her hearing, beneath the chant and the rattle and the wind, she heard it. A faint, familiar sound that stole the breath from her lungs. It was the sound of her daughter's laughter, not as it was at the end, weak and thin, but as it had been in the golden afternoons before the fever bright, clear, and joyful. It came from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the night wind. Her eyes flew open, wide with shock and yearning. She looked at the Lone Apache. His eyes were closed, his face turned upward, his chant uninterrupted, but a single tear traced a path through the dust on his cheek. The sound of laughter faded, replaced by a profound, echoing silence that seemed to ring. And then, on the blanket between them, where nothing had been a moment before, a single, perfect feather, white as moonlit snow, drifted down as if from the heart of the Milky Way itself, landing without a sound. The drumming stopped. The night rushed back in. The Apache opened his eyes, looking exhausted, years older. He looked at the feather, then at the widow's stricken, awe-filled face. "The marriage has been offered," he said, his voice hoarse. "Her journey has begun, but the path is not yet closed." He knelt slowly, as if his limbs were heavy, and did not touch the feather, but pointed to it. "This is for you." A sign, but listen. The widow, tears streaming silently down her own face, leaned forward, her soul straining. And in the new, deeper quiet she heard it again, not laughter this time, but a whisper so faint it might have been her own thought. It was her daughter's voice, clear as spring water, saying just one word, a word that held both a question and a plea, a word that tied the widow's heart in a knot of impossible hope and fresh, deeper fear. "Mama?" The word hung in the thin air of the mesa top, a sound woven from memory and starlight. It was not an echo from the cabin, not a trick of the wind whistling through the scrub. It was present, a gentle pressure against her ear, as real as the chill on her skin. "Mama?" The widow's breath stopped. Her hands, clenched in the fabric of her skirt, went utterly still. She did not look at the Apache, did not dare to move, as if the slightest motion might shatter this impossible moment. The hope that surged in her chest was a painful, bright thing, sharp as broken glass. The Lone Apache had gone rigid. The calm, ritual solemnity that had held him during the marriage was gone, replaced by a sharp, animal alertness. His dark eyes scanned the empty mesa, not with fear, but with a deep, troubled intensity, as if reading tracks in the air itself. He stared at the white feather, his expression grim. Slowly, he reached out, not to take it, but to pass his hand just above its delicate veins. He flinched, almost imperceptibly, and drew back. "This is not right," he murmured, more to himself than to her. His voice was rough, drained. The path was opened. The call was made. She should be walking the star road. She should be gone from here. She spoke, the widow whispered, the words tearing from a dry throat. "You heard her. My girl. She's here." The grief that had been a cold, heavy stone in her belly was now a frantic, fluttering thing. It was not peace she felt, but a wild, terrifying possibility. "She is here," the Apache agreed, but there was no comfort in his words, only a grave caution. "But she is not as she was. The marriage is a guide. It is a door held open. The spirit must choose to walk through. It must want to go." He finally looked at the widow, and his gaze was heavy with a meaning she couldn't yet grasp. Or something must be holding her here. Something strong. The widow's mind raced, a whirlwind of memories and regrets. Was it her own desperate love, clinging too tight? Was it some unfinished piece of her daughter's short life? A promise unmade, a fear unsoothed? "What do we do?" she asked, her voice small against the vastness of the night. For a long moment he was silent, considering the sky, the land, the feather between them. "We must understand the tie," he said at last. "We must go back, to the place she left. We must see what remains." He stood, his movements weary. "Bring the feather. Do not speak to the voice again." Not yet. To answer is to anchor her more firmly to this ground. The journey back down to the cabin was a blur. The widow moved as if in a dream, the feather clutched in one trembling hand, its touch impossibly soft. The earlier exhaustion was gone, burned away by a nervous, brittle energy. The Apache walked beside her, his silence a palpable force. The night seemed to watch them, the usual sounds of crickets and distant coyotes oddly muted, as if the land itself was holding its breath. The cabin, when they reached it, was no longer just a place of mourning. It felt charged, expectant. The lantern she had left burning cast long, jumping shadows. The air inside still carried the scent of his herbs, but underneath it, the widow fancied she could smell wildflowers, the kind her daughter used to pick in the spring. The Apache stood in the center of the small room, his eyes closed. He took a deep, slow breath, letting it out through his nose. He did not look at the narrow bed where the small form still lay, now seeming more like a discarded shell than a person. Instead, he seemed to be listening to the walls, to the very dirt floor. "She is close," he said quietly, "not in the body. Around it, like mist." He opened his eyes and looked directly at the widow. "You must tell me of her last days. Not just the sickness, everything, what she said, what she dreamed, what she feared. The spirit of a child is a simple, powerful thing. Its fears are simple, its loves are simple. Something simple is holding her." So the widow talked. She sat in her rickety chair, the feather in her lap, and the words poured out of her like water from a broken well. She spoke of the fever's sudden arrival, the way it had burned through her daughter like a prairie fire. She described the terrible thirst, the restless dreams where the girl called out names the widow didn't know. She recalled the moments of clarity, few and precious. How her daughter had asked for a drink from the creek, not the stale water in the pail. How she had talked about the big jackrabbit with the torn ear that lived near the wash, worried he wouldn't get his share of clover. How, on the last afternoon, her voice faint as a thread, she had said, "Don't let the dark bird get me, Mama." The widow had hushed her, called it nonsense, a fever dream. She had smoothed her hair and promised nothing would get her. She had thought she was comforting a child's irrational fear. The Apache listened absolutely still. When she mentioned the dark bird, his eyes sharpened. What did she say of it? "Just that?" the widow said, wiping her cheek. "Just the dark bird." I told her there was no bird. I told her she was safe. "In my people's way of seeing," the Apache said slowly, choosing his words with care, "sickness is sometimes a thing that comes, a spirit of illness. It can take many shapes. To a child, a shadow on the wall, a pain in the bones. It could be a dark bird." He knelt by the hearth, running his fingers through the cold ashes. "You told her she was safe. You promised." "But the bird came anyway. The sickness took her. In her mind, your promise was broken. The fear was stronger than the promise." A fresh wave of guilt, cold and sickening, washed over the widow. "You mean she stayed because she's afraid? Because I lied to her?" "Not a lie," he corrected gently. "A hope, but the spirit does not understand hope. It understands what is. The fear of the dark bird is real to her. It may be what pins her here. She may think it is still waiting." He stood, brushing the ash from his hands. "The Merage showed her the beautiful road. But if she is looking back over her shoulder, afraid of what is chasing her, she will not take the first step. Then how do we show her it's gone?" The widow pleaded, rising from her chair. "How do we make her see?" Before he could answer, a gust of wind, sudden and sharp, slammed against the side of the cabin. The lantern flame guttered wildly, throwing the room into a frenzy of swooping shadows. The widow gasped. For a heartbeat, one of those shadows on the far wall did not flicker like the others. It held a shape, a distinct, dreadful form, a vast, outstretched wing, a hooked beak, a single, shapeless eye. It was there, and then it was gone, swallowed by the normal dance of light and dark. The Apache had seen it too. A low sound, almost a growl, rumbled in his throat. "It is not just her fear," he said, his voice tight. "The spirit of the sickness, it has a shape. It fed on her life. It may not want to let her go. It may be clinging to the echo of her it left behind." The idea was monstrous. The widow felt the world tilt. This was beyond a mother's grief, beyond a simple burial. They were not just guiding a lost child. They were in a struggle for her against a thing born of fever and shadow. What can we do? Her question was a prayer. We must break its tie, the Apache said. His weariness seemed to fall away, replaced by a focused resolve. We must show your daughter that the dark bird has no power here, that the promise can be kept, even now. He looked at the feather in her hands. That is a sign of light, of air. It is from a good spirit, an ancestor perhaps, who heard our call. It is a weapon against the shadow, but it needs strength, my strength. The widow asked, her heart pounding. Your truth? He corrected. The truth of a mother's love, which is stronger than any fear. You must speak to her. Not to the air, but to the heart of her spirit. You must tell her you see the bird and you are not afraid. You must tell her you will face it for her. You must make her believe it so she can turn her back on it and walk into the light. He moved to the door and opened it, letting in the full sweep of the cold night. We will go back to the high place now, before the night grows old. This will be the final part of the marriage. Not a guide, but a battle. Are you ready? The widow looked from his fierce, determined face to the quiet bed, to the feather that seemed to glow in her hand. She thought of the whisper, that single, plaintive, "Mama." She was not ready. She was terrified, but she was all her daughter had. She nodded, her jaw set. Good, he said. Bring her blanket. And bring the child. The instruction was so simple, so devastating. The widow froze. She looked at the still form on the bed. You mean carry her? The body is the anchor for both the child's spirit and the shadow that hunts it, he said. We must bring the anchor to the sacred ground. It is the only way. I will carry her if you cannot. But the widow knew she had to. It was the last act of a mother's care. With a strength she did not know she possessed, she walked to the bed. She folded the quilt around her daughter's small, cold form, lifting her with a tenderness that cracked her heart wide open. The lightness of the bundle, the finality of it, was a new kind of agony. She turned, holding her child close, and faced the open door where the Apache waited, a stark silhouette against the starry sky. As she crossed the threshold, the wind moaned again. This time it did not sound like wind. It sounded like the rustle of immense, dry feathers, and from the darkness just beyond the reach of the lantern light, a pair of eyes, glittering with a faint, malevolent sheen, blinked once and were gone. The widow held her breath, clutching her daughter tighter. The path to the mesa stretched ahead, dark and steep. The real journey, it seemed, was just beginning. The climb back to the mesa was a pilgrimage of pure will. Every step was a battle. The widow's arms burned with the weight of her child, a burden she clung to with a fierce, desperate love. The quilt-wrapped form in her arms was no longer just her daughter. It was a battleground, an anchor for a soul and a shadow. The Apache moved ahead of her, a silent guide, his sharp eyes scanning the blackness around them. The night was no longer quiet. It seemed to breathe with a low, intent awareness. The usual rustles in the brush held a different quality, a sly, sliding sound that was not quite animal. The widow kept her eyes on the man's back, using him as a lodestone, focusing on the rhythm of her own ragged breath to block out the creeping sense that they were being stalked. Halfway up the path, a sudden, gut-churning coldness washed over her back, as if a door to an icehouse had swung open behind her. She stumbled, her foot catching on a loose stone. A dry rattle, like bones shaking in a gourd, seemed to come from the air just above her right ear. She gasped, hugging her precious bundle closer. The Apache stopped and turned, his hand going to a knife at his belt. He didn't look at her, but past her, into the deep gloom of the scrub oak and canyon wall below. His nostrils flared. It knows we are moving the anchor, he said, his voice low and flat. It does not like it. Keep walking. Do not look back. Your fear is its food. What is it? The widow whispered, her voice trembling against her daughter's quilt. Asekana, he murmured, a word from the old tongue that held a world of grim meaning. A sickness that took form. It is empty, it wants to stay full. It thinks the child's spirit is still its meal, he gestured upward. The high place has power. It is closer to the star road. There we have a chance to pry its fingers loose. They pressed on, the widow's legs trembling with effort and terror. The presence behind them felt like a pressure, a denseness in the air that pushed against her progress. She thought of the jackrabbit with the torn ear, of the simple, innocent worries of a child. Her daughter's fear had been pure, an animal instinct against the consuming dark. And now, that dark had taken a shape and followed them. They reached the mesa top. The vast expanse of sky felt both freeing and terribly exposed. The Apache directed her to lay the small bundle in the center of the blanket, now spread once more on the hard ground. He positioned the white feather at the child's head. Then he began to build a small, neat fire, not for warmth, but for light. The flames, when he struck the steel, caught quickly and burned unusually bright and blue at their heart. The light pushed the immediate darkness back, but it made the surrounding night seem even thicker, a solid wall of black beyond their tiny circle. "Now," he said, kneeling opposite the widow, the fire between them and the small still form, "you must speak. Look not at her body, but into the fire. See her there, in your mind, as she was in life. Speak to that image. Tell her the truth, you know." The widow's mouth was desert dry. She stared into the dancing blue heart of the flame. She tried to summon the image of her daughter's laughing face, but the shadow on the cabin wall, the shape of the dark bird, kept intruding. She swallowed hard. "My sweet girl," she began, the words cracking. "I'm here. Mama's here. I see it now. I see the dark bird you were afraid of." As she said the words, the fire flared and the wind moaned across the mesa, a sound full of complaint. "I was wrong to say it wasn't real. Your fear was real. But listen to me now. You listen." She leaned forward, her voice gathering a strength born of utter necessity. "It has no hold on you anymore. You left its cage? Your body is just a shell it thought it owned. It doesn't. You are not its meal. You are my bright, brave girl, and you are free of it." She paused, tears streaming down her face, her eyes never leaving the fire. She thought she saw a flicker within the flame, a tiny, dancing silhouette that was not a log burning. "The kind man here, he's shown you the road? The beautiful road in the stars, it's for you, it's where you belong now. You don't need to look back at that old, hungry shadow. I'm looking at it for you. I am telling it to go." As if in response to her declaration, the blue flame suddenly dipped, nearly going out. A wave of freezing air swept across the mesa, making the fire smoke and sputter. From the edge of the light just beyond where the Apache knelt, a form coalesced. It was not a full shape, but a suggestion, a pooling of deeper darkness that hinted at a hunched shoulder, a cruel beak, a single, lidless eye that reflected the dying firelight with a cold orange gleam. It did not advance, but it was there, watching, pressing against the boundary of their circle. The Apache did not turn to look at it. His eyes were locked on the widow, his expression urgent. "Good," he whispered. "Now the promise, make the promise true. Tell her what you will do." The widow understood. A promise broken by circumstance must be remade with spirit. She drew the deepest breath of her life, pouring every ounce of her love, her sorrow, her ferocious motherhood into her words. "I promised you'd be safe," she said, her voice ringing clear in the vast dark. "And I keep my promises. I stand between you and the dark bird. It will not touch you again. It cannot. You are under my protection, child, even now, especially now. Your safety is my last gift to you. Take it. Walk into that starlight. Be safe. Be at peace. I am holding the door for you." A sound emerged from the small bundle on the blanket. Not a voice, but a sigh, a soft exhalation that seemed to come from the quilt itself. The white feather trembled, then lifted on an unfelt breeze, hovering for a moment above the child's head before drifting gently down to rest upon her chest. At the same moment, the dark shape at the edge of the light let out a sound, a harsh, ragged screech of pure fury that tore at the ears. It surged forward, not toward the child, but toward the widow, a wave of bitter cold and palpable malice. The widow recoiled, throwing up an arm instinctively. The Apache was faster. He was on his feet in one fluid motion, his knife now in his hand, but it was not steel he presented to the shadow. He spoke a single, guttural word of command, a word that sounded like stone breaking, and thrust his empty palm toward the advancing darkness. The blue fire roared up, not with heat but with a blinding, silvery light. The shadow shrieked again, a sound of frustration and pain, and recoiled, breaking apart like smoke in a sudden gust. It did not disappear, but streamed away, dissipating into the general night, its malevolent presence fading to a dull, watchful ache in the atmosphere. The fire sank back to its normal size. The Apache sagged, catching himself on one knee, breathing hard as if he had run for miles. The widow sat frozen, her heart hammering against her ribs, the arm she had raised still tingling with cold. For a long moment there was only the crackle of the fire and the vast, star-dusted silence of the mesa. Then a new feeling seeped into the space. It was a lightness, a gentle warmth that had nothing to do with the flames. It felt like the memory of a spring morning, like the scent of wildflowers after rain. The widow looked at her daughter's form. The terrible, aching emptiness around it was gone. In its place was a quiet stillness, a sense of something completed. "Is she?" the widow began, not daring to hope. "The tie is broken," the Apache said, his voice thick with exhaustion. "The dark bird has lost its claim. Her spirit is free of that fear." He looked at her, and for the first time, she saw a deep sorrow in his eyes that mirrored her own. "But she is not gone?" the widow's breath caught. "What do you mean?" He gestured to the feather, now glowing with a soft internal luminescence on the child's chest. "She heard your promise. She believes it. The road is open, and the thing that hunted her is driven back. But she lingers still. A spirit does not only flee from something, it also journeys toward something." He paused, choosing his words with immense care. "You offered her safety. You did not offer her a farewell." A new kind of understanding dawned on the widow, bringing a fresh wave of pain. Letting go was not just about banishing fear. It was about releasing love. It was about opening her own clenched hand. Before she could form a question, a light caught her eye. Not the fire, not the stars. A soft, golden glow was beginning to emanate from the quilt-wrapped bundle. It was faint at first, like the first hint of dawn, but it grew steadily, warm, and gentle. Within that glow, the widow saw or felt the clear, bright image of her daughter's face, smiling, her eyes full of a love that had no bottom. The image held for a beautiful, heartbreaking moment. And then, without a sound, the light lifted. It rose from the blanket like a swarm of gentle fireflies, coalescing into a single, radiant point that hovered over them for a breath. It pulsed once, softly, with a warmth that touched the widow's cheek like a kiss. Then it streaked upward, faster than sight, joining the river of stars above, a tiny, brilliant addition to the Milky Way's endless road. The physical form on the blanket was now just that, a shell. The presence, the essence, the her of her child, was gone. A profound silence settled, deeper than any that had come before. The widow felt emptied out, scoured clean by a storm of emotion. She looked at the Apache. He was watching the sky where the light had vanished, his face unreadable. "She is walking the star road now," he said quietly. "She is safe." The widow bowed her head, a silent sob shaking her shoulders. It was done, the marriage was complete. Yet, as she looked from the peaceful form of her daughter to the wary, solitary man across the fire, and then out to the vast, whispering darkness of the territory beyond their small circle of light, she knew with a cold certainty that the night's work was not over. The dark bird had been driven back, not destroyed. It was out there, hungry and angry, and the man who had fought it with words and will, he was now standing between it and the only living soul left on this mesa. The conflict for her daughter's spirit had ended. But another, older conflict, it seemed, was just waking up. The silence after the light vanished was immense. It was not the absence of sound, but the presence of something finished. The widow felt that silence in her bones, a hollow echo where the frantic energy of the last hours had been. She stared at the small, quilt-wrapped form on the blanket. It looked different now, not just still, but empty in a way that was finally right. The terrible tension, the sense of a trapped spirit, was gone. Her daughter was truly gone, walking that star road. A peace settled over the child's remains, a peace that, for a fleeting moment, touched the widow's own ragged heart. But the moment was brittle. The fire, its blue heart now faded to ordinary yellow, popped and spat a spark into the dark. The sound was like a warning snap. The widow's eyes lifted from her child to the Lone Apache. He was not looking at the sky or the quiet bundle. He was staring out into the blackness beyond their circle of firelight, his body taut as a bowstring. The exhaustion that had weighed him down was gone, burned away by a sharp, vigilant tension. He held his knife loosely in one hand, his other resting on the ground, fingers splayed as if feeling the earth's pulse. "It is not over," he said, his voice so low the widow had to strain to hear it over the crackle of the flames. "She's free," the widow whispered, confusion cutting through her grief. "You said she was safe." "She is," he affirmed, still not looking at her. "The sea has lost its meal. It is angry. It is empty. And we are here." He finally turned his head, and his eyes in the firelight were like chips of obsidian. "It is a creature of hunger. It will seek to feed again, to reclaim what it thinks was stolen or to take something new." A fresh chill, colder than the night air, wrapped around the widow's spine. She had been so focused on her daughter's journey that she had forgotten the hunter. Her gaze darted to the surrounding darkness. The mesa top, which had felt like a sacred space moments before, now felt like a lonely island in a sea of hostile shadows. Every rock, every scrubby juniper seemed to hold a potential shape. "What do we do?" Her voice was a dry leaf rustle. "We must leave this place," he said, rising to his feet with a fluid grace that belied his weariness. "The high ground is good for seeing the spirit road, but it is exposed. We must get you back to the shelter of your walls." His eyes flicked to the child on the blanket, and a shadow of regret passed over his face. "We must take her with us. The body. It is still a link. A thing it knows. To leave it here would be an offering we cannot make." The thought of carrying her daughter back down that dark path, with that thing prowling, filled the widow with a dread so profound it was almost tasteable. But the alternative was unthinkable. She nodded, pushing herself up. Her limbs felt heavy, made of wood. She bent to gather the quilt into her arms once more. The touch was different. It was just cloth now, just weight. The sacred charge was gone, leaving only a profound and simple sorrow. The Apache did not rebuild the fire. He kicked dirt over it, plunging them into near-total darkness until their eyes adjusted to the starlight. He took the lead, his movements silent and sure over the familiar rock. The widow followed, clutching her bundle, her every sense screaming. The descent was 1,000 times worse than the climb. Before there had been a purpose, a desperate mission. Now there was only flight. Every scrape of her shoe on stone sounded like a thunderclap. Every sigh of the wind was a whispered threat. They were halfway down the path, a narrow ribbon along a steep slope, when the presence returned. It did not announce itself with a screech or a cold wave. It was subtler. The stars above a particular patch of scrub winked out, as if something vast had passed beneath them. A smell came on the air, not decay, but a dry, ancient scent, like a canyon floor that had never seen water, like dust from a long-sealed tomb. The Apache stopped. He didn't speak, but his raised hand was a clear command to halt. He stood perfectly still, head tilted, listening to something the widow could not hear. He slowly turned, putting his back to the widow, facing the uphill slope they had just descended. "It is between us and the cabin," he murmured, his voice barely carrying. "It is learning. It knows the places we must go. Can we go around?" the widow asked, her heart hammering against her chest. "There is no around here," he said. "Only through or back to the heights." He seemed to weigh a terrible choice. Going back to the mesa meant waiting for dawn, but dawn was hours away, and the thing was clearly done waiting. "We go through. Stay close behind me. Do not run, no matter what you see or hear. Running triggers the hunt." He began to move forward again, but his pace was different now, a slow, deliberate placing of his feet, a hunter's stalk in reverse. The widow mimicked his caution, her breath coming in short, painful gasps. The path widened slightly into a small, rocky clearing bordered by tall boulders. This was where the presence solidified. It unfolded from the shadow of the largest boulder, not as a distinct bird shape this time, but as a swirling column of darkness that drank the starlight. It had no true form, yet it suggested many a wing here, a talon there, the suggestion of a gaping maw. The cold radiating from it was intense, a deep bite that made the widow's teeth ache. But worse than the cold was the feeling it projected, a vast, yawning hunger, a loneliness so absolute it wanted to consume all warmth, all life to fill its endless emptiness. The Apache stepped forward, placing himself squarely between the widow and the swirling darkness. He did not raise his knife. Instead, he began to speak, not in the chanting tones of the Merage, but in a low, conversational voice in his own tongue. It sounded like he was reasoning with it, scolding it, reminding it of laws older than the hills. The sea, Anai, pulsed. A sound like grinding stones emanated from it. It did not advance, but it did not retreat. It seemed to be listening, or perhaps savoring the vibration of their fear, the heat of their living breath. The widow stood frozen, her arms locked around her child. She saw the Apache's shoulders tense. His words were having no effect. The hunger was too great. The shadow began to seep forward, tendrils of darkness creeping across the ground like spilled ink, reaching for the Apache's feet. He switched to English, his voice ringing with a command that surprised her. "You have no claim here. The child is beyond you. The living are under my protection. Return to the deep places. Return to the silence that bore you." The darkness coiled, then lunged. Not at the Apache, but around him, a swift, liquid dart of shadow aimed directly at the widow. It was not attacking to kill. It was attacking to claim, to wrap around the fresh grief, the potent fear, the living anchor of a mother's love that still held a physical piece of its former feast. The widow stumbled back with a cry, turning her body to shield the bundle in her arms. The Apache moved faster than thought. He didn't try to block the shadow with his body. He dropped his knife, and with both hands he made a sweeping, gathering motion in the air, as if pulling the very fabric of the night around him. He spoke one word, a name that was not a name, but a sound of pure creation, Hesievdi, Y, and threw his gathered hands forward. A sheet of silvery light, like captured moonlight, erupted from his palms. It was not a violent blast, but a net, a web of luminous threads that fell upon the advancing shadow. The Siana shrieked, a sound of genuine agony this time, as the light clung to it, sizzling like water on a hot griddle. It thrashed, contracting into a dense, boiling knot of blackness, repelled by the Apache's will and the ancient power he had invoked. But the effort cost him. He staggered backwards, falling to one knee, his breath coming in ragged, shuddering gulps. The web of light held, but it was already fading, and the shadow, though wounded and contained for the moment, was not gone. It pulsed within its luminous cage, furious, trapped, but very much alive. The widow rushed to his side. "Are you hurt?" He shook his head, but she could see the truth. The struggle had drained him. The fight against the spirit was not a fight of muscle, but of essence, and he had spent much of his. "It is bound," he gasped, nodding toward the seething mass a dozen feet away. "But not for long, the light will fade. We must go, now, while it is held." He forced himself to stand, swaying slightly. The path to the cabin was clear now, the way past the contained darkness open. But the widow looked from his pale, strained face to the furious entity he had caged. It was a temporary victory. They could run to the cabin, but what then? Wooden walls would not hold such a thing. It would come, it would wait. It would feed on their terror until it was strong enough to break through. They had reached a momentary safety, but the true danger loomed larger than ever. They had a respite, but no escape. The conflict was no longer about guiding a lost soul. It was about survival. And as the widow looked into the Apache's exhausted eyes, she saw the grim knowledge there. He had drawn its full attention, its full fury, and he did not know if he had the strength left to finish what he had started. The night was deepest just before the dawn, but the dawn felt a lifetime away, and the darkness between them, and it was now awake and angry and very, very hungry. The seething shadow in its net of fading light was a ticking clock. They could hear it, a low, grinding vibration that felt like it was coming from the rocks beneath their feet. The Apache swayed where he stood, the cost of his power written in the deep lines of his face and the tremor in his hands. The widow looked from his exhaustion to the cabin below, a dark square against the lighter land. Running there felt like a child hiding under a blanket from a storm of futile hope. The thing he called the Siana, he would follow. It would seep through the cracks, feed on their trapped fear, and grow stronger. The temporary victory on the path was just that, temporary. They had traded a swift chase for a slow, waiting siege. A strange clarity settled over the widow then, cutting through the terror like a clean knife. Her daughter was safe. That was the only victory that truly mattered. The crushing weight of maternal duty, the drive to protect, lifted from her shoulders. What remained was not a mother, but a woman. A woman who was tired of being hunted, tired of seeing this kind, weary man pour out his spirit for her. The grief was still there, a vast ocean inside her, but on its surface was a sudden, calm resolve. She was not going to run. She gently laid her daughter's bundled form on a flat, clean rock beside the path, arranging the quilt with a final, tender touch. Then she turned to the Apache. "It wants a claim," she said, her voice steadier than it had been in days. "It lost its claim on her, but it's found a new one, hasn't it? On you, because you stood in its way." He looked at her, surprised by her tone. He gave a slow, reluctant nod. "I challenged it. I used the old words, to such a thing that is a claim." "A challenge to be answered. And if there is no one to challenge?" she asked, taking a step toward the pulsing, captive darkness. The silvery web was growing thin, threads of light snapping silently like overtaut strings. He moved to stop her, but his strength was gone. He could only watch, his eyes wide with warning. "Do not, it will consume you, your fear, your life." "I'm not afraid of it anymore," she said, and realized it was true. The fear for her child was gone. The fear for herself felt small, a distant thing. All she felt was a vast, defiant anger. This thing had tormented her child's last moments. It had hounded her daughter's spirit. It was now trying to claim the man who had shown her a profound and saving mercy. It was a bully, a feeder on pain, and she was done feeding it. She walked until she was an arm's length from the edge of the fading light net. The cold was intense, a deep freeze that bit into her skin. The shadow within seemed to sense her, coiling and pulsing with eager malice. She could feel its hunger, its empty, aching need. It was a void. And she was filled with something too solid, too real for it to swallow. She did not know any ancient words. She had no sacred power. All she had was her truth. She thought of her daughter's laugh. She thought of the feather, a gift of light. She thought of the Apache's solemn kindness in a world that had given him little reason for it. She filled her heart with those things, pushing the last vestiges of terror out. "You listen to me," she said, her voice not loud, but clear and firm, echoing slightly in the rocky clearing. "You are nothing. You are a shadow cast by sickness. You are a bad memory. You have no power here anymore." She took another step, and the cold was so sharp it burned. "That child is gone. You will not touch her. This man is under my protection now. You will not touch him, this land, my home, my grief. None of it is yours to claim." The shadow rippled, a wave of offended fury. It pressed against the thinning web, which glowed brightly for a second before dimming again, weaker than before. The widow continued, pouring every ounce of her will into her words. "You are not welcome. There's no food for you here? Only light, only peace. And you don't know what to do with that, do you?" She did something then that felt as natural as breathing. She thought of the white feather, of the starlit road, of the moment her daughter's spirit had flown free. She held that image of perfect, radiant release in her mind, and she offered it not to the shadow, but to the night itself, to the air, to the spirit of the place. "This is a place of letting go," she declared. "You are being let go." As she spoke the final word, the last thread of the Apache's silver light snapped. The net vanished. The Siana-E Unbound surged forward with a triumphant, silent roar, a wave of absolute darkness meant to engulf her. It never reached her. Where the widow stood, filled not with fear, but with a profound, releasing love and a fierce, protective grace, the darkness met an invisible wall. It was not a wall of force, but of essence. It was like oil trying to mix with clear water. The shadow splashed against the space around her, swirling, trying to find a crack, a point of entry. A shred of the terror it needed to survive? It found none. The widow stood her ground, unflinching. She did not attack. She simply held her space, her truth, her declaration of its irrelevance. She was a rock in its path, and she was not moving. The shadow writhed, confused. Its hunger met not a meal, but a fullness it could not comprehend. Its anger met a calm it could not disrupt. It had been challenged by power before, by the Apache's ancient words. But this was different. This was a rejection so complete, so rooted in a human heart that had already passed through its greatest pain, that it had no answer. With a final, grating whisper that faded into the dry wind, the darkness began to unravel. It did not retreat. It simply came apart, the cold lifted, the sense of watching malice dissolved. The swirling blackness thinned, becoming transparent, then insubstantial, then gone. The stars overhead shone clear and bright once more. The ordinary sounds of the night, a distant owl, the rustle of a small creature in the brush returned. It was over. The widow's knees buckled, the sudden release of tension nearly dropping her to the ground. She caught herself, trembling from head to toe, not with fear, but with the aftershock of an effort she hadn't known she could make. A hand touched her elbow, steadying her. It was the Apache. He was looking at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a mixture of awe, respect, and a deep, weary gratitude. "You did not fight it with its own weapons," he said softly. "You denied it its very nature. You starved it with your courage. That is a power older than any words I know." They stood there for a long moment in the quiet night. Then, without a word, he moved to the flat rock and gently lifted the quilt-wrapped bundle. He carried it this time, and the widow was glad for it. The walk back to the cabin was solemn, but the oppressive dread was gone. The land was just land again, beautiful and harsh and indifferent, not a hunting ground. In the gray light before dawn, behind the cabin next to the small, tilting cross of her husband, the Apache dug a second grave. He worked with a steady, respectful rhythm. The widow watched, her heart a quiet, sore space inside her. When the hole was deep and straight, he laid the bundle within it. The widow stepped forward. She had one thing left to do. She opened the quilt one last time, kissed her daughter's cool forehead, and then placed the white feather over her heart. She folded the cloth back over, a final tucking in. Together they filled the grave. The sound of earth on earth was the only sound in the world. When it was done, the Apache placed a smooth, heavy stone from the creek at the head. He said a few soft words in his own tongue, a blessing for journeys. The sun was cresting the distant hills, painting the sky in streaks of rose and gold. The widow and the Lone Apache stood side by side, looking at the two mounds of fresh, dark earth. "She is walking the star road," the widow said, not a question, but a statement. "She is," he affirmed. "And the dark bird is gone, not just from her, from this place?" "You sent it back to nothing." He turned to go, his figure silhouetted against the rising sun. The widow felt a pang. This solitary man, belonging nowhere, had given her everything. "Wait," she called. He paused. She had nothing to offer him, no silver, no locket, but she had words. "Thank you. For the marriage, for standing with me. You have a place here, if you ever need one, a meal, a rest. You are not alone in this territory, not if I have anything to say about it." He looked at her, then at the cabin, then back at the graves. A faint, almost invisible softening touched his stern mouth. He gave a single, slow nod. It was not a promise to return, but an acceptance of the offer, an acknowledgement of a bond forged in the most difficult of fires. He walked away, blending into the long shadows of the morning, becoming part of the landscape once more. The widow stood alone as the full sun warmed her face. The air smelled of dust and pine and the rich scent of turned earth. The grief was still there. It would always be there, a part of her now, but it was clean grief. It was not tangled with fear or guilt or the torment of a trapped spirit. It was just love with nowhere to go. She looked at the two graves, then at the empty cabin, then at the wide, wild land stretching out under the boundless sky. She was alone, but for the first time since the fever took hold, she did not feel lonely. She felt peace. It was a hard-won peace, paid for in courage and tears and the strength to let go. She went inside to face the empty rooms, not with dread, but with the quiet understanding that her daughter was finally, truly safe, and that she, the widow, had finally kept her promise.